So this is our second week looking at the prophecies of Jesus' ministry, death, and resurrection. And what's that? I have another one. Did you get it? Here's a... So in this second week, we're going to be looking at the Lamb. And that's kind of a central part. So next week, we're going to get into all the goody little verses, like, tons of verses that Jesus fulfills. It's just going to be bam, 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 one right after another. But kind of for these first 2 weeks, we've been exploring kind of some themes. So if you remember last week, we looked at the nature and ministry of the Messiah. So what was it that the people were expecting? Honestly, they were a little bit confused. Kind of like, and I don't want to, be mean to them or anything, because we're kind of confused in a way. Look at all the different views that we have on Revelation and the end times. It's difficult to interpret. But now for us looking back on the Messiah, it's like, well, of course, this is how everything unfolded. But they were looking for like 3 different Messiahs. There were a lot of different views on it. But how could it be one person? But we looked at how the Messiah would be the Son of God and the Son of Man. This is in your notes from last week. He was a prophet and a priest and a king. Priests and kings did not mix. That was not something that you did. But he is able to fulfill both of the roles. He's our king and the priest. He's both God and man. And then we looked at how Jesus' ministry itself actually was prophesied ahead of time, and he fulfilled those scriptures. And there's many more. We just shared a few examples of that. But 5 examples we did mention last week is that he was baptized by the Spirit, and that's prophesied in Isaiah 11:2. He would be consumed with zeal for God's house, and that's where he overthrows the money changers' tables and all of that. And the disciples remember that and go, wow, okay, here he is. He is doing this. It was also prophesied that he would heal the blind, deaf, and the lame. That's also in Isaiah. This one always strikes me as interesting. It was prophesied that he would speak in parables. Did you know that? So just what his teaching style was really classified as speaking in parables. In fact, one of the gospel writers said that he spoke in parables so often that he didn't teach other than using parables. Now that's an exaggeration because we have many examples of other teaching styles, but it was a lot. And they just stumped people. And so that was prophesied as well. And then another one that's really amazing is that his ministry would happen in Galilee. And Galilee was seen as just this out-of-the-way place that was not looked on real highly. Pick the state or the location of your choice that you feel like, oh, well, people from there, that's how they felt about Galilee, right? And yet it was prophesied in Isaiah 9 that this light would appear in Galilee. And so that's what we looked at last week. So this week, we turn our attention to the Lamb. And I think someone challenged me one time when I was being discipled. He said, how would you summarize the entire Bible to someone, maybe in a couple of sentences? That's kind of a big challenge. And the way that he went about doing it is he used this idea of the Lamb and basically tracing the theme of the Lamb throughout the Bible. Now, there are many ways, if you had to summarize the Bible for someone, there's many different views that you could use. But I think this is a really nice one. It very neatly summarizes the Scriptures and the Scriptures teaching on the Messiah and the sacrificial system. And so really what it is, it's a great way for you to share the gospel using imagery of the Lamb. And so that's a little bit of the lens that we're going to be using today. And so our first stop on this journey is to look at how God provides the lamb. Now, in this story, you're going to see it's a ram, and so sometimes the animal changes. We'll just say it's lamb-like, but the Scripture's dominant theme for the Messiah is the sacrificial lamb. But there's a lot of lamb-like or lamb-adjacent creatures that are used. Okay? So we're going to be in Genesis chapter 22. This will be a familiar story for you, Genesis chapter 22, but I think we definitely should go here. To set this up, though, we should just remind ourselves of one previous sacrifice, which we have talked about multiple times, actually even recently. You remember that Cain and Abel offer sacrifices. and Abel offers the best of his flock. Okay, so there was a sacrificial system that was implemented. We don't know the details of it. We just know that God accepted Cain's sacrifice, even though he brings his best veggies. God seems to have ordained a sacrificial system of a live, unblemished animal from the flock. That was the acceptable sacrifice. Okay, so we're not given the details of that, but that was something that they were supposed to do. And we could even go earlier than that, and the first sacrifice would be how instead of killing Adam and Eve, because didn't God promise, on the day that you eat from this tree, you will die? And they didn't. Isn't that interesting? They did not die that day. Instead, he took an animal and covered them with the animal's skins. What happened to the animal?
It could have been a spiritual death.
Yeah, there definitely is spiritual death there. There's separation. And that's one thing that commentators will mention. You're absolutely right. Very good. Yes. So there's a spiritual death immediately. There's separation between Adam and Eve. There's conflict in their marriage. There's consequences to sin. There's separation from God. So that, yes, absolutely happens. Exactly. So we have this sacrificial system. But here we have this time in Abraham's life where God is going to have Abraham offer a sacrifice. And so starting in verse 1, after these things, God tested Abraham and said to him, "Abraham, here I am," he answered. That's always a great way to answer God. Here I am. "Take your son," God said, "your only son Isaac, whom you love, and go to the land of Moriah, and offer him there as a burnt offering on one of the mountains that I will tell you about." And so Abraham got up early in the morning, saddled his donkey, and took with him 2 of his young men and his son Isaac. He split the wood for a burnt offering and set out to go to the place God had told him about. And on the 3rd day, Abraham looked up and saw the place in the distance. And then Abraham said to his young men, "Stay here with the donkey and the boy, and I will go over there and worship, and then we will come back to you." Have you ever taken the time to notice that before? God says, "Go sacrifice your son." Abraham says, "We are going to go worship, and we will come back to you." Isn't that interesting? Somehow Abraham knows the outcome of this here. He has faith.
Well, it's trust. We can trust.
Yeah. He's trusting God. Yeah, very good. So Abraham took the wood, verse 6, for the burnt offering and laid it on his son Isaac. In his hand he took the fire and the knife, and the 2 of them walked on together. Then Isaac spoke to his father Abraham and said, "My father." And he replied, "Here I am, my son." Isaac said, "The fire and the wood are here, but where is the lamb for the burnt offering?" And Abraham answered, "God himself will provide the lamb for the burnt offering, my son." And the 2 of them walked on together. So there again, just repeating that idea of his trust. And when they arrived at the place that God had told him about, Abraham built an altar there and arranged the wood. He bound his son Isaac and placed him on the altar on top of the wood. And then Abraham reached out, took the knife to slaughter his son, but the angel of the Lord called to him from heaven and said, "Abraham, Abraham." And he replied, "Here I am." And then he said, "Do not lay a hand on the boy or do anything to him, for now I know you fear God, since you have not withheld your only son from me." Abraham looked up and saw a ram caught in the thicket by its horns. And so Abraham went and took the ram and offered it as a burnt offering in place of his son. And Abraham named that place, "The Lord will provide." So today it is still said, "It will be provided on the Lord's mountain." So, let's wrap this up. A couple of great verses here. Verse 15. Then the angel of the Lord called to Abraham a second time from heaven and said, "By myself I have sworn, this is the Lord's declaration. Because you have done this thing and not withheld your only son, I will indeed bless you and make your offspring as numerous as the stars of the sky and the sand on the seashore. Your offspring will possess the city gates of their enemies, and all the nations of the earth will be blessed by your offspring because you've obeyed my command." We're not looking at this verse today, but I believe we looked at it at Christmas time. This statement, "all nations of the earth will be blessed through your offspring," is a prophecy of the seed, Eve's seed, that would be the Messiah, be a blessing to all nations. Paul picks that up, I believe, in Galatians 5 or somewhere in Galatians. He uses this idea, and I think again in Romans. So that's something that Paul picks up on, this theology that Jesus is the answer to that blessing for everybody. So just want to pick up on that. Now, we see that this lamb that God provides the lamb. God provides the sacrifice. It's in place of human life, just like we saw with Adam and Eve, just like we saw with Abel. He's offering the sacrifice. It's a substitute for a life. Now, this is a great passage to camp out for another reason. This is also, Isaac is considered one of the types of Christ. And this is something that's going to come up a lot when we look at prophecy. And so I thought it's worth kind of camping out a little bit here. This is not in your notes, but if you'd like to kind of add this onto the side. A type, maybe, so this is kind of an older word. We don't really use this today in the same way. Maybe a better way to think about it is foreshadow. In fact, some of your translations will also use that, especially in the book of Hebrews, which we will actually see today. The word foreshadow is used. Okay? And if you're now having nightmares of English class in school, you're probably not alone. My students hated it when we talked about foreshadowing. It didn't make sense to them. And, it's like, what is this talking about? Maybe a way to think about this is, let's imagine that you're waiting for somebody. And let's say that you're waiting outside. Maybe you and a friend are going to go hiking or something like that. And, you're sitting in this spot waiting for your friend to show up. And you see this shadow coming around the corner, the shadow of a human being. It's not the shadow of anything else, it's the shadow of a human being. And because you know your friend, that is the shadow of my friend. But the shadow is not your friend, obviously, right? Your friend is on the way. Your friend is catching up to that shadow, and sure enough, yes, the shadow rounds the corner, and there is your friend. That's what this word type means. It's that there's some image or some shadow that makes you go, that is a picture of the Messiah. The Messiah is not here yet, so Isaac is one of the first types of Christ, or the foreshadows of Christ. Isaac is not Jesus. We're not saying that Isaac is Jesus, just like the shadow is not your friend. But it's an image that reminds you of your friend, and you know your friend is coming. So let's then take a look here. What are some ways that Isaac and Jesus are similar, based on this passage that we just read here?
The plan was
He was sacrificed. Yeah, very good. What else? There's a lot of them. A lot of really neat ones here.
He trusted his father.
Yeah, he did. Completely. Okay?
Firstborn?
What's that?
Firstborn?
Firstborn. Your firstborn only son. Yeah, that's a good one too. Yeah. We could just stop there, and that's enough just to kind of contemplate on. What else? Any others?
He also did question, like, where's the ram? What are we going to take to sacrifice? And I think Christ in the sermon, he did say, is there any other way?
Yeah, is there any other way? I like that parallel. That's good. That's good. One I thought was interesting that a lot of commentators bring up here is Abraham takes the wood and puts it on his son, and his son bears the wood up the mountain to the place of sacrifice. Think about carrying the cross. Yeah. Although some commentators caution and say, we can get into dangerous waters when we start looking at this stuff, because soon every piece of wood in the Old Testament represents the cross, which some people have done. That's taking it too far. We do have to be careful with these and exercise some restraint. But I think that one is, at least, it just makes me smile and go, yeah, I think that's probably right. But, so there's a lot of cool ones here. We may have...
The mountain is, as far as the Calvary Hills.
Yeah, mountain is good, yep. Mm-hmm.
Well, in the desert, there wouldn't be much wood, so not only was the ram provided,
Yeah.
but the wood was provided.
And the wood. Yeah, that's a good point. I like that. Good. Okay. So that's our first stop here, is that God provides. And that theme is important, because when we think about the lamb, this is not a work that we can do, right? This is like the first picture of the gospel. It's that God provides it. It's not a work that anyone's doing here. But next, yes, go ahead.
Isaac didn't, it looks like he didn't fight it.
Yeah.
He wasn't, he went along with it.
He was a willing participant. Yep. That's a good one too.
Third day, that's the other thing I saw was third day.
Oh, yes. Thank you. Yeah, third day is mentioned here. Yeah, that's interesting. Good. Cool. Yeah, keep thinking about that if you come up with other ones. Let's move on to point 2 here. The next thing that we see, the next little picture, is the lamb covers the people. And that's a significant leap, okay? Let's talk through that. The lamb covers the people because first, we see that the sacrifice is covering individuals. We see that Abel offers a sacrifice for himself. We see that here is Isaac who's going to be sacrificed, but God provides a lamb in place of him. But now this sacrifice is going to cover the people. So let's turn to Exodus 12, and we're going to pay attention to the Passover here. We're going to learn about the Passover. And what I'd like for you to do as we go through this, to see if you can jot down some of the key features of the Passover. And that's going to be important later as we look at the Passover during the Passion Week for Jesus. So there's a reason we're doing it. Of course, it's good to know about these things and connect the Old Testament to the New Testament, but I just want you to have those details so you can kind of pick up on these things later. That's what the gospel writers are wanting you to do, because a lot of times they won't tell you. But when you know the original and then you are starting to read the New Testament, you're like, wow, I see some interesting similarities here. Okay, so let's read a couple of verses here. Exodus 12, verses 1 through 13. The Lord said to Moses and Aaron in the land of Egypt, "This month is to be the beginning of months for you. It is the first month of your year. Tell the whole community of Israel that on the 10th day of this month they must each select an animal of the flock according to their father's families, one animal per family. If the household is too small for a whole animal, that person and the neighbor nearest his house are to select one based on the combined number of people. You should apportion the animal according to what each will eat. You must have an unblemished animal, a year-old male, and you may take it from the sheep or the goats." So again, sheep-adjacent creatures here, sheep or goats. Okay? "You are to keep it until the 14th day of this month, and then the whole assembly of the community of Israel will slaughter the animals at twilight. They must take some of the blood and put it on the two doorposts in the lintel of the houses when they eat them. And they are to eat the meat that night. They should eat it, roasted over the fire with the unleavened bread and bitter herbs. Do not eat any of it raw or cooked in boiling water, but only roasted over the fire. Its head as well as its legs and inner organs. Yum." That doesn't say yum. I'm just added that. "You must not leave any of it until morning. Any part of it left until morning must be burnt. Here's how you must eat it. You must be dressed for travel, your sandals on your feet, your staff in your hand, and you're to eat it in a hurry. It's the Lord's Passover. I will pass through the land of Egypt that night and strike every firstborn male in the land of Egypt, both people and animals. I am the Lord. I will execute judgment against all the gods of Egypt. The blood of the houses where you are staying will be a distinguishing mark for you. When I see the blood, I will pass over you. No plague will be among you to destroy you when I strike the land of Egypt." Okay? And then we'll skip over to 42 and through 47 here. Of course, there is quite a bit of great things in here, but just for the sake of time, we'll skip over to 42. "It was a night of vigil in honor of the Lord, because he would bring them out of the land of Egypt. This same night is in honor of the Lord, a night of vigil for all Israelites through all generations. And the Lord said to Moses and Aaron, 'This is the statute of the Passover. No foreigner may eat it, but any slave man who's been purchased may eat it after you've circumcised him. A temporary resident or hired worker may not eat the Passover. It's to be eaten in one house. You may not take any of the meat outside of the house, and you may not break any of its bones. The whole community of Israel must celebrate it.'" And he gives a couple of other instructions, but those will be the focus pieces for us today. Okay? So this is the first time the Passover is instituted. It does look a little bit different later because this one is celebrated in Egypt, and it's the idea of the angel of death passes over their house instead of killing them because it sees the blood of the sheep or the goat on their doorposts. Okay? And then there's this meal that they have. A little bit later on, it does look slightly different, but this is the one that we'll focus on today because it has a lot of relevance for us. What are some of the details that stood out to you, kind of the key features of this Passover?
When they said on the 4th day they are to eat it.
Yeah. fourth day they're to eat it.
Again, it's like the day he was raised.
Mm-hmm.
You know?
Mm-hmm. Yep, a lot of
One that
similarities there.
confused me was, why eat it with haste?
Yeah. So this is something that changes. It's kind of a reenactment of the Exodus from Egypt, because as soon as this plague ends, that's when Pharaoh says, go. And so notice that they're also to eat it while they're dressed for travel. And so the men would take their robes and they would gird them up. So they pull the robes up and stick it into their belts. So they have like short robe now, so that they can move around faster, right? So they would do that. They would have their packs and everything. And so it's one of those feasts that they can get ready to leave at a moment's notice. So they're eating really fast and they're getting ready to go. Okay?
So
But when, yeah,
would they would have known the gods of Egypt had,
yeah.
right? And they could have counted off the ones that happened. And they might have even understood that was the last.
Could have, yeah. They would have been familiar with the gods of Egypt.
Yeah.
And in fact, they many times want to turn back to those gods. You know, we had our life easier, now that they're in the wilderness.
Because that's when they
Much later.
used Moab would offer
Mhm.
children.
Yeah.
Question, where's the King Herod was involved with that? That was in Egypt. I mean, you said it was in Egypt. Well, I thought Herod
Involved
wanted
in-
all the kids to be killed.
Okay, so that's an interesting parallel, because in Egypt, Pharaoh kills all of the boys at one,
Why?
or tries to, because the Israelites are multiplying so much. Because when they came in, they were a small, insignificant people, but God was blessing them. So this is in, I think, Exodus chapter 1. And so it basically, now there's this new Pharaoh that arises. He doesn't know Joseph. He doesn't know any of that. All he sees is these foreigners who are among us. Suddenly, they're multiplying so rapidly, they're going to take over the kingdom. So he subjugates them, makes them slaves. They still are just growing like crazy. So he starts to tell the midwives, drown the kids, don't, like the boys, don't let them reproduce. They don't. But that's why then Moses is secretly shipped off on his miniature ark. That's literally the term that's used, is the ark, is because of that edict. So it's really interesting then that Herod does that same thing, trying to prevent the Messiah. So that is why Moses is a type of Christ as well. We don't have time to kind of look at those details, but there's a prophecy which we looked at Christmas time where God says, out of Egypt I called my son, my Messiah. And so we said, how is it that Jesus fulfills both, like being born in Bethlehem and Egypt? And there's that parallel with Moses. It's because to escape Herod killing all of the boys, they fled to Egypt, where the Pharaoh had tried to kill all the boys hundreds of years earlier. So, it's an amazing parallel there. Good question. Yeah. So, a lot of details in this. Let's kind of narrow it down to a few. Tell me about the lamb. What are the details about this lamb that they're to have here?
Unblemished.
Unblemished lamb. Yep.
No broken bones.
No broken bones. Okay. May or may not be important. We'll see.
Yeah, maybe.
What else?
It had to be, it had to be a year old.
Yeah, year old. Yep.
Are the herbs in the bread going to be
Yeah,
that they use on the cross?
Tell me more about the stuff they eat with it. What kind of bread is it? Unleavened bread. Okay, so this isn't risen stuff. This is flat, crispy type bread, unleavened. And what else? Hi.
Would the herbs be like how Jesus was treated after he died?
Yes, and more so, we're going to see some other parallels. So there's a lot of cool things with these. So those are key details. So if you don't have these, have details about the lamb. So this is a young lamb that's killed. Its bones are not broken. That's an important detail. Its blood is on the doorposts. And then along with that lamb, they're eating unleavened bread with bitter herbs. Okay? There's all kinds of things that we can talk about here, but we'll simplify it to kind of that right now, and then maybe at another time we can kind of come back to these, because the whole thing, there's so much significance to it, but we'll let that suffice for now. Okay, So we've moved from the Passover, that God provides the lamb for individuals, and then the lamb covers the people. But now, number 3, the lamb, or goat in this case, is a substitute and carries the sin outside of the camp. And I think I have a lot of blanks there, so let me write this up on the board here. So the lamb is a substitute and carries sin outside of the camp. So we've got to understand now something called the Day of Atonement. And this is maybe something that you're familiar with, but this is one of those that the gospel writers really kind of expect you to know. But as Gentiles and, not being raised in that kind of culture, not seeing it, we're so far removed. Like sometimes we just don't get this. And it is a lot. It's a lot to understand. But let's go over to Leviticus chapter 16. We'll try to get some key details of this. Leviticus chapter 16. This is the Day of Atonement. This is a great representation, I think, of the sacrificial system. I mean, you can read all of Leviticus and other parts of the first 5 books of the Bible to get a good picture of what the sacrificial system was like. But if you want to camp out in one place and try to get one thing down, the Day of Atonement is a fantastic place to go. It's so representational of the gospel, and it gives you an idea of just how seriously God takes this system and just how much blood was shed to cover people's sins. I mean, think about it. Just all of the death that you would be hearing at the temple of all of these different animals, the blood that's everywhere, the burnt offerings. I mean, some of it's sweet smelling, but there's a little bit of an element of horror there that I think we're missing. Like, especially if you think about the Passover that we just witnessed, where they bring this lamb into their homes, and imagine the kids being able to play with that lamb, and then dad goes out and kills the lamb, and then they eat it. So that's kind of tragic. But then the dad could say, and this lamb that you enjoyed being with for the last couple of days is now your substitute, so you do not die. And that's the picture there. So let's take a look at the Day of Atonement. Leviticus chapter 16. The Lord spoke to Moses after the death of the 2 sons of Aaron, when they approached the presence of the Lord and died. And to that story, they basically broke God's law and decided to do things on their own. That doesn't work, okay? The Lord said to Moses, "Tell your brother Aaron that he may not come whenever he wants into the holy place behind the curtain in front of the mercy seat on the ark, or else he will die, because I will appear in a cloud above the mercy seat." So if you want to know the significance, which we'll look at later, of why the curtain is torn from top to bottom in the temple when Jesus dies, that Holy of Holies, this is kind of when that starts. That Holy of Holies is the presence of God, and you can't just go in there. Even the high priest, Aaron, can't go in there unless something very specific happens. That is how holy God is. And so he's going to describe that to us. Aaron is to enter the most holy place in this way, with a young bull for a sin offering and a ram for a burnt offering. So Aaron himself, the high priest himself, has to have 2 sacrifices just for himself. He is to wear a holy linen tunic, and linen undergarments are to be on his body. He is to tie a linen sash around him and wrap his head with a linen turban. These are holy garments. He must bathe his body with water before he wears them, and he is to take from the Israelite community 2 male goats for a sin offering and 1 ram for a burnt offering. If you're keeping track, this is different from the sacrifices for Aaron. Okay, so he has to have personal sacrifices for himself, but then we're going to focus in on this sacrifice here. He takes 2 male goats and 1 ram for a burnt offering for the people. Okay, he takes it from the community. Aaron will present the bull for his sin offering and make an atonement for himself and his household. Next, he will take the 2 goats and place them before the Lord at the entrance to the tent of meeting. After Aaron casts lots for the 2 goats, rolling dice or bone-like things that are like dice, 1 lot for the Lord and another for an uninhabitable place, or the wilderness, your translation might say, He is to present the goat chosen by lot for the Lord and sacrifice it as a sin offering. But the goat chosen by lot for an uninhabitable place is to be presented alive before the Lord to make atonement with it by sending it out into the wilderness for an uninhabitable place. Now, he's going to go into more detail about that in case you didn't get it, because it is a lot of information really fast. So he's going to zoom into that in just a second. So if you're like, what? Hang on, okay? But essentially, we've got a lot of different animals and different rituals are happening with them. He's making an atonement for himself. In other words, in order to be able to go into this most holy place, this sacrifice must take place. But then he's also performing a sacrifice for the people. And it's a very special sacrifice beyond the sacrifices that they're already making. This is a very special Day of Atonement. And kind of the central focus is these two goats. And he's rolling dice for these two goats. One of them is going to be sacrificed. One of them is going to be sent outside the camp. That's called the scapegoat. If you've ever heard that term scapegoat, that's where it comes from. Okay, let's continue in verse 11. When Aaron presents the bull for his sin offering and makes atonement for himself and his household, he will slaughter the bull for his sin offering. Then he's to take a fire pan full of blazing coals from the altar before the Lord, and 2 handfuls of finely ground fragrant incense, and bring them inside the curtain. He's to put the incense on the fire before the Lord, so that the cloud of incense covers the mercy seat that is over the testimony, or else he will die. So he goes into the Holy of Holies, and he's using the sacrifice as kind of a picture of his sin is being covered. He's able to come into the presence of God. Aren't you thankful we don't have to do that anymore? We can come directly before the throne of grace because of Jesus. He is to take some of the bull's blood and sprinkle it with his finger on the east side of the mercy seat. I know this is a lot of detail, but I want you, and the author of Hebrews, we're going to end class today with the author of Hebrews, and he's going to talk about this. So I want you to have that prepared. And just think about this. He's taking blood with his finger and he's sprinkling it over here on this side of the mercy seat. And then he will sprinkle some of the blood with his fingers before the mercy seat 7 times, just getting all this blood and just chucking it around places. When he slaughters the male goat for the people's sin offering and brings its blood inside the curtain, he will do the same with its blood as he did with the bull's blood. So he's bringing more blood in there. Okay? He is to sprinkle it against the mercy seat and in front of it. He will make an atonement for the most holy place in this way for all their sins, because the Israelites' impurities and rebellious acts. He will do the same for the tent of meeting that remains among them, because it's surrounded by their impurities. So he's chucking more blood around. Verse 17, no one may be in the tent of meeting from the time he enters it to make atonement, even the most holy place, until he leaves after he's made atonement for himself, his household, and the whole assembly of Israel. Then he will go out to the altar that is before the Lord. So he's going out of the Holy of Holies, going to the main altar, okay? And make atonement for it. He is to take some of the bull's blood and some of the goat's blood and put it on the horns on the side of the altar. He is to sprinkle some of the blood on it with his finger 7 times to clean it and set apart for the Israelites' impurities. So this is the altar that they would be sacrificing on a daily basis throughout the year, right? And now this is like the time where he's performing, we'll just call it holy maintenance on it, where he's like, all right, now let's, got a big sacrifice and just cleanse this of all of the sins. So it's a really amazing thing here. Let's see here. Altars, verse 19, verse 20. Okay, when he's finished making atonement for the holy place, the tent of meeting, and the altar, he's to present the live goat. Okay, so he's killed a bull, he's killed the goat. Okay, the other one is the scapegoat. We're going to focus on that one now. Verse 21. Aaron will lay both of his hands on the head of the live goat and confess over it all of Israel's iniquities and rebellious acts, all of their sins. And he's to put them on the goat's head and send it away in the wilderness by the man appointed for the task. So there's some dude who's in charge of taking this lamb out into the wilderness. Okay, the goat will carry all of their iniquities into the desolate land, and the man will release it there. Then Aaron is to enter the tent of meeting, take off the linen garments he wore when he entered the most holy place, leave them there, and he will bathe his body with water in the holy place and put on his clothes. So he's got 2 baths today instead of the normal none. Then he must go out and sacrifice his burnt offering and the people's burnt offering, and he will make atonement for himself and the people. He is to burn the fat of the sin offering on the altar, and the man who released the goat for the uninhabitable place is to wash his clothes and bathe his body in water. And afterwards he may re-enter the camp. So he's unclean, right? So he needs to be able to re-enter the camp to be clean. He has to take a bath. Okay? Verse 27. The bull for the sin offering and the goat for the sin offering, whose blood was brought into the most holy place to make atonement, must be brought outside the camp, and their hide, their flesh, and their waste are to be burned. And so remember, they had offered those as sacrifices, and their parts are just kind of hanging around right now. So he's like, take that stuff outside the camp, get rid of it. The one who burns them is to wash his clothes and bathe himself with water, and then he can re-enter the camp. Okay, it's unclean. This is to be a permanent statute for you. In the 7th month, on the 10th day of the month, you are to practice self-denial, do no work, both the native and the alien who resides among you. Atonement will be made for you this day to cleanse you, and you will be clean from all your sins before the Lord. It is a Sabbath of complete rest for you. You must practice self-denial. It is a permanent statute. The priest who is anointed and ordained to serve as the high priest in place of his father will make an atonement. He will put on linen garments, the holy garments, and make atonement for the most holy place. He will make atonement for the tent of meeting. The altar will make atonement for the priests and all the people of the assembly. This is to be a permanent statute for you to make atonement for the Israelites once a year because of all their sins. And it was done as the Lord commanded Moses. So those last few verses kind of summarize the whole thing. So you get the idea of everything that's happening there. It's a lot of sacrifices. It's a lot of blood.
Jewish holiday is that?
The Day of Atonement is what they called it. Yeah, Day of Atonement. Yep.
Do they still go through this
No,
process?
because they don't have the temple, so they can't offer sacrifices. So what it's turned in, and I don't know a lot about this, but I did see a video one time where someone was asked, like, what do you do now? And they have kind of a ritual beating that they go through before God, where they do this, and they're confessing their sins, and so it's almost like they're taking it on, in a way. But I know that there are some people that are hoping to be able to rebuild the temple. And I have heard some, when I was at the seminary, I heard this really interesting talk. I forget who it was, but it was during one of our conferences, and he was talking about how they are breeding animals to get kind of the purebred stock that they used to have so that they can re-implement some of the sacrifices. Unfortunately, that's all I know about it. So, I can't go further down
I saw an
that.
article that there's like either 4 or 6 of the red peppers.
Yeah, it was the red heifer that he was talking about. So, yeah, so that's kind of interesting because you've got to have certain types of animals to be able to offer these sacrifices.
Isn't that Golden Dome the temple?
It is, but it's not their temple. That's the Muslim temple. So it's the
They
site
must
of the
have took
temple.
The temple from the Israelites, right?
No, the temple was destroyed in AD 70 by the Romans. And so it was completely desecrated. And I don't remember the time period when the Dome of the Rock was built on that site, but that's also a holy place for Muslims. And both Jews, well, some Jews, and Muslims believe that that's the site that Abraham offered Isaac. And so they both believe that to be a holy site. But to the Jews, that's the historical place where the temple has been. But now, even though they own that area, the temple itself that's there is a Muslim temple, not a Jewish temple. So, yeah.
Yom Kippur and Day of Atonement are the same thing.
Oh, thank you.
So,
I didn't know that.
observant Jews still practice Yom Kippur, the holiest day of the Jewish year, focused on repentance and forgiveness,
Awesome.
marked by fasting and special religious services. So, I
Mm-hmm.
know where our daughter lives in Brooklyn, there's a lot of very Orthodox
Mm.
Jews, and they don't even have public school
Oh, okay.
on Yom Kippur Day.
Oh, thank you for that. Yeah.
Those are Hadassic Jews, but there's various versions of Orthodox Jews, but
Yeah.
yeah, they're the Hadassic Jews where have the
Sideburns.
side
Mhm,
and stuff.
mhm.
Yeah.
All right, so let's focus in on these two goats. I mean, oh, yes.
Okay, everybody else probably knows this. So the actual place where these are being sacrificed and all this blood stuff is just very few people doing physically there, just the priest though.
Normally, all the priests can enter in, and this drawing is not going to be 100% accurate, but this is the tabernacle, so this is the movable temple. Later, then Solomon's going to build the actual temple, and then there's a couple of versions of that temple because some of them are destroyed, and it has a similar layout. But what they had is kind of a tent area, and the altar is right in here, and it's got these little horns on it, like this. And so the priests can enter into this area. They're performing the sacrifices, and I believe there's kind of another area over here, and the Holy of Holies is right in here. Okay. Normally, the priests are able to move and act inside this area. But for the Day of Atonement, only Aaron can. That was one of the things that he mentioned here. So all of the others are out until Aaron finishes basically atoning for this entire place. But inside the Holy of Holies, only the high priest is able to enter that, and only once a year.
And that was, the thing I like about that is that they had to wear bells
Yeah.
because they needed to be like a rope around their leg, because if something, they die in the middle of whatever happens, no one can come in to get them. They have to be able to be dragged out.
Pull them out. Yep.
That's just like the cool, I don't know why that's a picture that's cool for me, but.
All I know is I wouldn't want that job.
Yeah, yeah. That would be
Thank
a
you.
tough job. Yep.
I'm just thinking how, okay, they're doing this, and everyone else that, you know, this is being sacrificed for all the people's sins. I'm just thinking how easy it would be for all of the other people to not really take that super seriously,
Yeah, that's a good point.
you know, because
Yeah,
it's
because
being
how
done
else can they
separate
see?
from them, and
Yeah.
And how well can they see? They don't see what's actually happening
Well,
Yeah.
it smelled awful.
completely.
Yeah.
But they could
They
smell
definitely would be gathering. They'd be able to see that goat being let out. They'd see all the other people taking
Right.
stuff out in the
See some.
wilderness. Yeah, that's a good point.
And
They
don't
could hear it.
Don't they have like a tub to drain it in? I would think the tub would be
I
like
think
full.
so. Yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah. So you're seeing stuff taken out of that area
Yeah.
outside the camp.
Right.
Yeah, for sure. Especially on the sacrifice days. Yeah. Okay, so with all those pictures of blood in your head, which is important for where we're headed here, and I'm going to pick up the pace significantly because I do want to make sure we finish here pretty soon, so that we can go down to the meeting if you would like to partake in that meeting. I think the pastor said maybe 11:25, 11:30. So we're going to try to finish up here really rapidly. And if we'd like, we can pick up some of these details next week and go a little bit more in depth. But those two goats right there, one of them is sacrificed. The other one takes the sin outside of the camp. Those are the kind of the two details that you need to focus on. One of them is killed. The other one takes the sins outside of the camp. The last point that I have here for you today is showing how Jesus is the Lamb that takes away the sin of the world. And that's in John 1:29. That's what John the Baptist says, is behold, the Lamb of God that takes away the sins of the whole world. Don't take that statement for granted, because look at where we've been today. The Lamb substitutes for one person. The Lamb covers all of the nation of Israel. And then the two goats take on the sin of the entire camp. But now you're talking about the Lamb that takes away the sins of the whole world. Do you see that jump? This is why this is a great picture to look at how, the entire Bible can kind of be summarized here. Now here's Jesus. He comes on the scene. He's taking away everybody's sin and takes away the sins of the world. You're supposed to see those two goats. Both things are happening. Notice how two goats kind of capture this picture. He places the sins on the one goat and kills it in place of the people. Otherwise, the people would have had to die. That's what's happening here. Either you all die or this goat dies. And then the other one carries their sins out into the wilderness. And so that's what we're supposed to be picturing here, is Jesus is that lamb who is killed, but also he's the lamb that takes the sin outside the camp. How? How do we see that? The next couple of letters here are to help us understand that. Jesus' Passover. I'm going to have to summarize this, and you can read about it later if you'd like, but I've given you two parallel passages in Matthew and Luke. Jesus' Passover, they eat the unleavened bread and bitter herbs. We do not see them eat the lamb. The writers do not talk about the lamb, which is really fascinating. And then what happens is Jesus institutes the Lord's Supper, which we're going to be taking here in a couple of weeks. We're really excited about that. And that picture of now the bread representing his body and the cup representing his blood, and that tie to the sacrificial system. So he's tying this back to the Passover. He's just like you ate this bread and bitter herbs, that's now, and you were saved because you killed the lamb and put its blood on the doorpost. That's representative of me. He's tying it back to that. Okay? But it's really fascinating that they don't eat the lamb. So Jesus is the Passover lamb, and we see a couple of different examples. Did I list those examples, or are those all blanks? I need to know how fast I can go.
Blanks.
They're all blanks. Okay, so I'll go slowly. Number one, Jesus is the Passover lamb because he's crucified outside the city. Okay, and if you look at the gospel accounts, Golgotha, or the place of the skull where he's crucified, it's not in the city, because that death and that he dies is a curse. It's not something that you have in the city. It's unclean. That happens outside the camp. Remember the scapegoat that's taken outside the camp and killed, and all the remains of the animals they've been sacrificed is taken outside the camp. Hebrews is going to take that, so this isn't something I made up. The author of Hebrews says, since Jesus suffered outside the camp, he connects that idea, which we'll maybe be able to look at here in a minute. So that's the first one. He's crucified outside the city. Number two, vinegar is offered to him on a hyssop stick. I gotta write this one down. Vinegar is offered to him on a hyssop stick. I believe this is in John. I'm sorry I didn't write John's verse on here, but I believe this is one that we're going to look at again next week in more detail. But Jesus says, I thirst. And so they offer him vinegar to drink, wine mixed with vinegar. Or some of your translations will say gall. And the stick that they use to, kind of on a sponge and carry it up to the cross for him to drink out of is a hyssop branch, which a lot of commentators say that's weird that they focus on that.
The door.
Yeah. It's a hyssop branch that the blood is wiped up on the doorpost for the lamb. Okay, you see that? That's neat. Vinegar is bitter, so there's the connection to the bitter herbs. There's a prophecy that we'll look at next week. Number three, his bones are not broken. That was significant. This was very customary for if they were going to make death on a cross faster, they would break your leg bones. But we don't see, when they come to him, he's already dead, so the Romans do not break his bones. They didn't get lazy. These guys were paid. Their job was to make sure this guy is dead. They don't break his bones.
How could the lamb not be broken bones when they sacrifice?
Cut the throat.
Yeah.
Well, okay, but I mean, if they're gonna eat it, you gotta dismember it, right?
So they dismember it without breaking the bones. It's a very meticulous process. And so probably what they're not counting is the separation of the joints, potentially. That's not breaking the bone, it's the individual bone. Yeah. I think next week I have on the list to look at Psalm 34:20, so we're not going to go there right now. But the last one, he died on the same day as the Passover lamb. He died on the same day as the Passover lamb. And that's John 19:14. John says that it's the day of preparation for the Passover. Now, scholars do debate this point quite a bit because they had merged two holidays, the holiday of the unleavened bread with the Passover, plus it's also the Sabbath. And so it's a lot of holidays coming together. And so it seems like Jesus and his disciples are celebrating Passover, but the question is, which holiday are they actually celebrating? So maybe they didn't have the lamb because it was not that Passover and it was a different time. It doesn't really matter. The point John says in 19:14, this was the day of preparation. And if you do the math, as people much smarter than I have done, when Jesus says it is finished, that's when they're killing the lamb for the Passover meal. Okay? So do you see that? Jesus fulfilling this idea of Passover. He's fulfilling the Day of Atonement. He is the goat that goes outside of the camp, but he's also the goat that is killed. So it took two of them, just like they had to have a priest separately from a king, and Jesus was both. Those two goats, one. Okay, last thing we'll take a look at, we're going to have to skip Hebrews 9 for now. Let's look at Hebrews 13. Hebrews 9 basically says, there's so much blood. And you could basically say that without blood, there's no remission or forgiveness of sins. Because he looks at all of the blood that we looked at, and he's like, there is so much of it everywhere. There's blood on everything. And he kind of goes through and reviews that with you. And then he says, Jesus' blood is a more perfect sacrifice. It's needed to offer once. It doesn't have to happen over and over and over again like we had before. So Hebrews chapter 13, starting in verse 12, says this: Therefore Jesus also suffered outside the gate, so that he might sanctify the people by his own blood. Sanctify, atone for, make holy. That idea of the Day of Atonement echoes within these verses here. Let us then go outside the camp bearing his disgrace. In other words, let us not be afraid to suffer and die on his behalf as well. But this is pointing to, basically saying, that scapegoat, that is Jesus. That is the author of Hebrews' intention here, and we'd be seeing that picture. Okay? So if I could sum up everything from today, and sorry that we had to go through it so fast, it's that Jesus is the fulfillment of all of the sacrificial systems of the Old Testament. We just looked at a couple. We looked at the Passover and the Day of Atonement, and how he fulfills all of those, and how the gospel writers show us that with John's testimony, behold the Lamb that takes away the sins of the world, Jesus' own Passover, what they are eating and what they're not eating, and what he says about it, and then the details about his crucifixion that show that he is the Passover Lamb. So let's go ahead and pray, and then I'd love it if you are able to join to vote on our new children's pastor. That'd be great if you can join that meeting. So let's finish up today. Lord God, I ask that you would continue to work in the hearts of everybody here as they continue to mull over these passages. I know we did have to go through it really fast today, Lord, and there's probably a lot of questions and many other things. We could have talked about this, and I had to skip through some passages. Lord, help us as we continue to think about it this week. Bring more truths home to us. Help us to see more cool things. But most of all, Lord, help us to be able to apply this to our lives. And Hebrews 13, verse 13 here actually gives us one great one. Let us suffer outside the camp. Let us bear his reproach and follow him no matter what happens to us. There's many others. And Lord, I just thank you. I worship you, Lord, and say thank you for fulfilling all of these things. Thank you that we don't have to offer sacrifices anymore, that your sacrifice was enough. Lord, help us now as we take a look at this children's pastor and vote on him and all of that. Lord, guide that discussion. I ask in your name. Amen.
If you have week 1 on the